Two neighbors with nuclear weapons on the brink of war. India carrying out its deepest strikes inside Pakistan in more than 50 years. We are committed to take firm and decisive action against terrorists and those who support them. China's role is very interesting here. On one hand is their iron brotherhood with Pakistan. On the other is the reset with India amid the trade war with the US. What does China value more? India has just unleashed hell on Pakistan. Over the past few hours, dozens if not hundreds of missiles flew across the skies and blew up at least 9 terror-linked locations across Pakistan and Pakistani-occupied Kashmir. But you know what's crazy? This isn't even Pakistan's biggest nightmare right now, it's China. Xi Jinping dreaded this exact moment ever since Pakistan pulled off a horrific terrorist attack against India. You see, on April 22, 2025, 5 heavily armed terrorists carrying M4 carbines and AK-47 ESAs quietly crossed into Indian territory and entered Pahalgam, a well-known tourist spot in Kashmir. Just like the attacks we saw in Israel where civilians were deliberately hunted down, these men went after Hindu civilians, targeting them deliberately and murdering dozens in cold blood. They stopped tourists one by one and forced them to prove they were Muslim by reciting a Quranic verse. If someone passed, they were let go. If not, they were ordered to pull down their pants to check if they were circumcised, a practice common among Muslims, but not the Hindu community. Those who failed both tests, mostly Hindu men, were executed on the spot. Their wives, children, and friends were made to watch, and now they're left with a kind of trauma that never leaves. And that's exactly why India isn't holding back anymore. They're retaliating with raw vengeance. And whether China likes it or not, it will be dragged into this, because if it doesn't step in, the hundreds of billions it has poured into Pakistan won't just go up in flames, so will its entire South Asian strategy. If that wasn't bad enough, Pakistan's military heavily relies on Chinese-made weapons, most of which haven't faced a single real-world conflict intense enough to genuinely test if they perform as effectively as China claims. This ongoing conflict is the first true battlefield test for Beijing's military technology, and by the looks of it, things aren't going well. Chinese-supplied radar and missile defense systems have utterly failed to protect Pakistani airspace, allowing India to hit every intended target, one terrifyingly close to Lahore itself. Even more humiliating, a Chinese-made JF-17 Thunder, an advanced fourth-generation fighter jet, has already been shot down. That's an enormous embarrassment for both Islamabad and Beijing. So if this conflict blows up into a full-scale war, no one's going to care who started it. The blame game will end and the chain reaction will begin. Everyone with even a shred of influence near or far will be pulled into it, and China will be the front of that line. Now, of course, YouTube is not a fan of war-related topics, and CCP bots are not a fan of videos that criticize the CCP. So in this video, we need your help more than ever. If you can hit that like and subscribe button down below, it really does help us out with this YouTube algorithm. Okay, let's start. Now, we all know that China and Pakistan like to call themselves all-weather Iron Brother allies. This deep bond began in 1951 when Pakistan was one of the first Muslim nations to recognize the new People's Republic of China. Since then, Beijing has poured loads of cash into Islamabad, to the point where today, 1/3 of Pakistan's entire external debt, roughly $30 billion, is owed to Chinese state banks and commercial lenders, making Beijing by far Pakistan's biggest creditor. If we're being honest, China couldn't care less about Pakistan's stability or long-term prosperity. For the CCP, Pakistan is nothing more than a strategic cash cow. And the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, is exactly how they milk. CPEC is a $62 billion mega project at the very heart of China's Belt and Road Initiative. It includes a massive network of highways, railroads, fiber-optic communication cables, power plants, and industrial parks, all linking Kashgar and China's Xinjiang province directly to Pakistan's deep water port of Gwadar on the Arabian Sea. China has secured a 40-year lease that gives it control over the Gwadar port, letting Beijing pocket around 90% of all the revenue generated. Meanwhile, Pakistan is left scrambling for whatever's left. The crazy part is, China has cunningly structured these contracts in a way that makes it almost impossible for Pakistan to ever realistically pay back the huge loans tied to these projects. Basically, the terms are stacked completely against Pakistan from day one. Chinese firms were handed huge equity stakes, generous long-term leases, and guaranteed payments. On top of that, Pakistan even agreed to purchase the electricity generated from CPEC power plants at extremely high fixed rates, which they're legally obligated to pay no matter what happens to their economy. In fact, some of these agreements openly promise Chinese investors massive returns, as much as 34.5% every single year. With terms like these, it's clear that sooner or later Pakistan will be completely overwhelmed by debt. Eventually, they'll have no choice but to hand over full control and permanent rights to critical infrastructure like ports, power plants, and highways directly to China. It's a classic debt trap and one that's already caught dozens of other countries in its net. But China isn't just in this for quick cash or massive returns. The real benefit China gets from CPEC goes way beyond just money. It also provides China with an incredibly important alternative shipping route, one that lets Chinese oil tankers and cargo ships completely bypass the narrow and vulnerable Strait of Malacca. Right now, about 80% of China's imported oil passes through this strait, which the US Navy or regional rivals like India could block off. In a military confrontation or a geopolitical crisis, that's exactly why the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, is so strategically important. It gives China a critical backup route, dramatically reducing this vulnerability. India knows this, and that's precisely why if China tried to intervene or send military support to Pakistan, then CPEC would instantly become India's #1 military target. To justify this attack, India has already openly declared the entire corridor a violation of its territorial sovereignty, because it runs right through land India officially claims as its own. Gwadar Port, the southern endpoint of CPEC, is especially concerning for India, as New Delhi suspects it will soon serve as a Chinese naval base. To fully understand just how vulnerable China really is here, let's take a close look at this map. The CPEC corridor begins right here in China's Xinjiang region. From there, it crosses into Pakistan through a narrow mountainous pass known as the Khunjerab Pass. After that, it heads straight down into Gilgit-Baltistan, a highly sensitive region that India officially claims as part of its Jammu and Kashmir state. So basically, this massive Chinese-funded project cuts right through territory that's already deeply disputed. To India, it's an open insult and a direct challenge to its authority. Now, with a conflict already underway, the billions China poured into CPEC might soon become worthless. India could immediately launch an offensive to take back what it firmly considers its own territory, instantly turning the entire northern half of the CPEC into an active war zone. China knows this danger perfectly well. That's exactly why they've already stationed thousands of soldiers throughout this sensitive area, desperately trying to guard their investments and keep control. But honestly, even with those troops in place, if an actual war breaks out, none of that will really matter. Those billions of dollars China spent building highways, power plants, and infrastructure would instantly become sitting ducks, easy targets within direct range of Indian artillery, missiles, and fighter jets. And we're not talking about hypothetical long-range strikes here. These locations could be hit with deadly accuracy in mere minutes. As for Pakistan, despite heavily relying on Chinese cash and military support, they're already failing to defend these vulnerable projects. Pakistan's economy is collapsing, and its military is stretched dangerously thin. With Indian strikes already hitting targets deep inside of Pakistan, Beijing is now facing an urgent decision. Step in directly with its own forces to safeguard billions of dollars in investments or risk losing everything. But as you'll soon see, that's actually extremely unlikely. And I'll explain exactly why in just a bit. But first, let's move a bit further down south on our map, because as messy as things look up north, the situation down here in Balochistan is actually even worse for China. Now, if you haven't heard much about Balochistan, don't worry. You're definitely not alone. But let me quickly explain why this region matters so much right now. Just like the conflict in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir we discussed up north, the troubles in Balochistan also began around the very birth of Pakistan itself back in 1947. Back then, when British India was being divided into India and Pakistan, Balochistan wasn't even fully sure it wanted to be a part of the newly created Pakistani state. You see, before Pakistan officially became a country, a big part of what is today called Balochistan belonged to a separate princely state known as Kalat. The ruler there, known as the Khan of Kalat, initially had no interest in joining Pakistan at all. He wanted complete independence for his region, but Pakistan had completely different plans. Under heavy pressure from Islamabad, the Khan of Kalat eventually gave in and officially agreed to join Pakistan in 1948. Not everyone agreed with this decision, though. In fact, the Khan's own brother, a man named Prince Abdul Karim, rebelled immediately. Abdul Karim fled across the border into neighboring Afghanistan, gathering local fighters and quickly launching the very first armed rebellion against Pakistan in July of 1948. That rebellion set the stage for decades of ongoing tensions and conflicts that continue right up to today. Now, at this point, you're probably all wondering, Why exactly are the people in Balochistan still fighting nearly 80 years later? Well, there are a few important things you need to know. First, to start off, Balochistan is huge. It's actually Pakistan's largest province by far, covering more than 40% of the entire country's land area. It's also loaded with huge reserves of natural gas, massive copper mines, gold deposits, oil fields. I mean, you name it, Balochistan probably has it somewhere underground. Yet, despite sitting on all this immense wealth, the people living there are some of the poorest in the entire country. To put this into perspective, even though over 40% of Pakistan's natural gas comes directly from Balochistan, many local residents there don't even have basic gas connections in their own homes. Instead, the riches from Balochistan's natural resources are pumped straight into Islamabad and wealthier provinces like Punjab. So, what do the local people get in return? Honestly, not much. Mostly pollution, neglect, poverty, and empty promises. Basic essentials like schools, hospitals, and even clean drinking water are often scarce or completely missing in many parts of Balochistan. Politically, local Baloch leaders are regularly ignored, sidelined, or completely shut out by powerful outsiders, political elites, or the Pakistani military. So, with all of that going on, you can probably imagine how frustrated locals felt when China suddenly turned up around the late 2000s, ready to spend billions of dollars building roads, railways, and pipelines straight through their tribal land. At first, China made huge promises. They talked about creating thousands of new jobs, bringing better lives, opportunities, wealth, and basically making locals feel like they finally struck gold. But in reality, those promises never actually came true. Instead, local people woke up to a completely different reality of Pakistani troops everywhere, Chinese managers running things, and highways slicing right through tribal lands that had belonged to them for generations. Foreign flags started appearing in their hometowns, checkpoints popped up all over the place, and pretty soon locals didn't even recognize their own neighborhoods anymore. It definitely didn't feel like home. So naturally, all this built-up frustration quickly turned violent. Local rebel groups, especially one known as the Balochistan Liberation Army, the BLA, began directly targeting Chinese projects and personnel. For instance, in April of 2022, a suicide bomber attacked a university in Karachi, specifically killing 3 Chinese teachers who were working there. Just 1 year earlier, in 2021, another bomb ripped apart a bus carrying Chinese engineers, killing 9 of them instantly. And these are only some of the high-profile incidents that made global headlines. In reality, there have actually been dozens of other small but deadly attacks targeting Chinese workers, engineers, convoys, and infrastructure all across Balochistan. Another big problem that China and Pakistan now have to deal with is the Taliban taking back control of Afghanistan in 2021. At first, most people assumed the Taliban would remain friendly with Pakistan. After all, Pakistan had openly supported and sheltered the Taliban for decades. But surprisingly, that's not what ended up happening. Instead, after regaining power, the Taliban quickly began to openly distrust and dislike Pakistan, and soon relations turned sour. In fact, since coming back into power, Taliban fighters have been repeatedly clashing violently with Pakistani soldiers along their shared border, and the situation keeps escalating. For example, in December of 2022, Taliban fighters directly attacked several Pakistani border outposts near Shaman, killing multiple Pakistani soldiers and sparking serious tensions. Just a few months later, in September of 2023, intense battles broke out again, this time at the busy Torkham border crossing, leaving several people dead and many more injured on both sides. The Taliban hasn't even tried to hide their anger towards Pakistan. They openly accused Pakistan of interfering inside Afghanistan's internal affairs, secretly sheltering militants opposed to Taliban rule, and overall behaving more like an enemy rather than the ally they were expected to be. In fact, ever since the Taliban regained power, Baloch separatists have found it much easier to operate freely along the porous Afghan-Pakistani border. For decades, Afghanistan has quietly provided refuge, shelter, and even training grounds for anti-Pakistan groups. Now, with the Taliban back in charge and openly distrusting Pakistan, this trend has increased significantly. It's become easier than ever for militants opposed to Pakistan to move, operate, and even plan attacks from Afghan territory. Meanwhile, surprisingly, the Taliban's relationship with India has actually been warming up lately. At first, India was understandably cautious. Remember, the Taliban used to be considered enemies, especially since India strongly supported the previous Afghan government. But recently, the Taliban government and India have started quietly engaging in direct talks, trying to find common ground. In fact, India has even sent humanitarian aid to Afghanistan and reopened its embassy in Kabul. Basically, India seems to be following the old logic of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and honestly, so far it seems to be working pretty effectively for them. There are even rumors floating around, though I have to mention nothing is officially confirmed yet, that certain factions within the Afghan Taliban might secretly be helping India hunt down Pakistani militants or wanted individuals hiding near the Afghan-Pakistani border. Now this might sound surprising at first, but if you think about it, it's actually not completely crazy. Historically, the Taliban have had deep connections and working relationships with different militant groups. Making these sorts of quiet, behind-the-scenes arrangements wouldn't exactly be new territory for them. And especially given the recent tensions and outright hostility between the Taliban and Pakistan, it's honestly not all that hard to believe something like this could be happening behind closed doors. On the other hand, relations between China and the Taliban are way more complicated. Sure, officially and publicly, the Taliban government says it's open to Chinese investment, especially because China promises badly needed money and infrastructure. But in reality, the trust between them is pretty shaky. The Taliban aren't exactly thrilled about China's harsh treatment and crackdown against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, especially since many Afghans share strong ethnic, religious, and cultural ties with the Uyghurs. And all of this chaos, the Taliban, the Baloch rebels, the tensions with India, is creating a perfect storm for both Pakistan and China, especially when it comes to their huge joint projects like CPEC and BRI. Now, before we keep going, let me quickly clear up something. People often mix up CPEC and the Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI and CPEC are definitely related, but they're not exactly the same thing. You see, the China-Pakistan economic corridor we've been talking about is actually just one specific part, although a hugely important part of something much bigger, known as China's Belt and Road Initiative. BRI is China's gigantic global master plan to build roads, ports, railways, and all sorts of major infrastructure projects in countries literally all across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe. It's essentially China's big vision to directly connect itself with every major economy around the world. By doing this, China aims to slash costs, open up brand new markets for Chinese products, and position itself as the economic and political center of the globe for decades to come. And if you thought CPEC was massive, then the Belt and Road Initiative is on a whole different level. It's basically the godfather of mega projects. To put things into perspective, China has already dumped around $1 trillion into the BRI, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Experts now believe China's total investment in this gigantic and global scheme could explode beyond a mind-blowing $4 trillion by the late 2030s. Yeah, you heard that right. Trillion with a T. We're talking about an amount of money large enough to completely reshape the global economy, politics, and power dynamics for generations to come. Back when China first announced these big infrastructure projects, tons of countries jumped at the opportunity, drooling over the potential profits and the wealth they thought they'd make. And honestly, you can't fully blame them. China presented the whole thing like some kind of dream come true, and it sounded like the perfect deal. But now, fast forward just a few short years later, and the reality has turned out completely different. Many of these countries have quickly discovered they're barely able to pay back the huge Chinese loans they took on to build these projects. In fact, some countries are literally on the brink of bankruptcy. Take Sri Lanka, for example, probably the most famous example so far. Sri Lanka borrowed billions of dollars from China to build ambitious infrastructure, including the massive Hambantota port. But when Sri Lanka predictably couldn't repay its debts, China just swooped in and took control of the port on a 99-year lease, effectively gaining long-term strategic control over a critical piece of infrastructure right at India's doorstep. And this isn't just happening in Sri Lanka. Over in Africa, nations like Zambia, Kenya, and Ethiopia are now buried under enormous debt from Chinese projects. And sadly, they've seen very little actual economic benefit. Zambia even made global headlines when it defaulted on international loans, partially because it simply borrowed too much money from China and couldn't keep up with the repayments. And guess what? China expected Pakistan would end up trapped just like these other countries. And like the others, none of these Chinese investments helped Pakistan's economy. Instead, the exact opposite has happened. The country is now drowning in debt. Right now, Pakistan is running dangerously low on foreign currency reserves. Inflation is through the roof, prices for everything are skyrocketing, and they're barely able to make the minimum payments on their debt interest, let alone paying back the original loans. What China was really hoping for was another scenario like Sri Lanka, where Pakistan would get so deep into debt that Beijing would eventually step in and gain permanent control over critical areas, especially those strategic territories in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, the POK. But here's where China's plans could completely fall apart. If war breaks out and India strikes first, bombing key infrastructure and quickly reclaiming territories it considers its own, then all of China's carefully laid plans go straight up in smoke. Losing control of CPEC, the crown jewel of the Belt and Road Initiative, would set off a massive chain reaction, becoming the first domino to fall in China's global strategy. I mean, think about it. Every other nation involved in the Belt and Road Initiative would suddenly stop and ask themselves, wait a second, if China couldn't even protect their biggest project right next to their own borders, why are we risking our economies with these projects too? And so would be the death of Xi Jinping's ultimate dream project. That's exactly why the instability around CPEC is a ticking time bomb for China's entire Belt and Road Initiative. And trust me, China absolutely cannot afford for this to fall apart. If all of this still doesn't feel like enough reason for China to jump in and defend Pakistan, well then, let me give you a few more reasons. Right now, thousands of Chinese engineers, technicians, and even soldiers live and work inside Pakistan. By one count, over 14,000 Chinese nationals have recently been involved in CPEC projects. Many of them are concentrated in dangerous areas like Gwadar and other parts of Balochistan, exactly where militants and insurgents have repeatedly targeted Chinese workers before. Just in the past few years alone, there have been more than a dozen major attacks specifically targeting Chinese citizens working in Pakistan, killing dozens of them. Chinese diplomats have openly voiced their frustration, even publicly, calling it unacceptable for us to be attacked twice in only 6 months. Which is why Beijing sent its own security team equipped with armored vehicles to protect these sensitive projects directly. Now imagine how much worse this could get if the conflict escalates further. Fortunately for the Chinese, India's strikes have so far remained limited to Muzaffarabad, Kotli, Bagh, and selected targets in Punjab province. But make no mistake, Gwadar and the rest of Balochistan aren't too far away. The moment China escalates tensions or tries playing hero, every Chinese worker, every technician and soldier, along with their families in Karachi, Lahore, Gwadar, and across Pakistan, instantly become a potential target. China would immediately face a logistical nightmare evacuating thousands of its citizens from an active war zone while scrambling to protect billions of dollars in vulnerable infrastructure. In a desperate situation, the Pakistani army might even hand over direct protection of some crucial assets entirely to China. But realistically, Beijing knows very well that it simply can't afford to ignore an Indian offensive threatening its own people and facilities. In other words, having so many citizens and critical investments scattered across Pakistan guarantees that China would be forced to step in one way or another. But that's exactly why, over the past few decades, China has continuously pushed, bribed, or outright bullied Pakistani politicians and generals into heavily relying on Chinese-made weapon systems. Today, Pakistan is officially the single biggest buyer of Chinese military equipment anywhere in the world, purchasing everything from advanced JF-17 fighter jets, Vermont, 4 main battle tanks, and powerful armed drones to sophisticated missile defense systems. This heavy reliance on Chinese hardware means that if China decides to directly step into the conflict, its forces would seamlessly integrate with Pakistan's military, since both would already be using largely identical equipment and systems. Meanwhile, on the other side, India would be fighting with a complex mix of Russian, French, Israeli, American, and domestically developed weaponry. Military analysts around the world have pointed out that clearly, any war between India and Pakistan would essentially turn into a live, real-world battlefield test. A direct face-off between Chinese-made weapons and India's mix of Western-backed and domestically built systems. And the results of this test would have huge global consequences. Essentially, it could decide whether China continues to dominate as one of the world's top weapon suppliers, or if its military exports suddenly take a massive hit to their reputation. The same goes for the West. If India's Western-made weapon systems perform exceptionally well, they'd instantly attract global buyers and build trust worldwide. We've already seen what happens when military systems don't perform as expected. Just look at Russia over the past 3 years. Russian weapon systems have performed embarrassingly bad in Ukraine, damaging Russia's global reputation again and again. It's now safe to say that Russia's days of dominating the global weapons market are effectively over for at least this decade, probably longer. And now, just a few hours into this conflict, Chinese military hardware is also failing. Supposedly advanced radar systems proved useless, missile defenses offered no real protection, and a prized Chinese-built JF-7 fighter jet has already been shot out of the sky. If China's weapon systems can't survive even a few hours of missile attacks, then imagine the dreadful scenario of an all-out war. But beyond just weapon sales and reputation, there's another huge reason why China absolutely can't afford to lose Pakistan or see it falling apart. Strategically, Pakistan has always acted as China's frontline ally and a crucial buffer against India's growing power in South Asia. The two countries even solidified this alliance decades ago. Back in 1963, Pakistan officially handed over the mountainous Shakgam Valley, just north of Kashmir, directly to China, helping Beijing cement its control over key parts of the broader Kashmir region. Today, China directly controls about 20 to 30% of Kashmir, including the high-altitude Oksai Chin Plateau, an area also claimed by India. And this region isn't just symbolic or politically sensitive, it's incredibly important strategically. Oksai Chin holds China's critical highway G219, which is the only reliable land connection between China's Xinjiang province directly with Tibet. Military experts repeatedly warn that losing control of Oksai Chin, or even temporarily having this crucial highway cut off due to fighting, could seriously threaten the security and stability of China's entire western border region. If India and Pakistan go to war, there's a real chance Indian forces might push even deeper into disputed territories. That could quickly put Indian soldiers just a few miles away from China's own border, the sensitive line of actual control, or the LAC. Indian military commanders have openly said that they're actively preparing to handle two hostile borders at the same time. Basically, they're making it crystal clear they're ready to take on China directly if that's what the situation demands. And we've already seen exactly how tense and dangerous this scenario can become. Back in 2020, Indian and Chinese troops violently clashed in Ladakh's Galwan Valley. It was a deadly fight that shocked both sides and showed just how quickly things can spiral out of control. So, in a major conflict with Pakistan, India might deliberately provoke or escalate tensions near Ladakh, intentionally opening up a second front just to pile immense strategic pressure directly onto China's sensitive region of Tibet. India knows exactly how to push China's buttons in this area. Tibet is already an extremely delicate region for China politically, culturally, and militarily. Even a small escalation near Ladakh could force China into diverting critical resources, dealing with internal instability, or worse, a wider border conflict. In fact, India has been actively preparing for exactly this kind of scenario. They recently ordered advanced military aircraft, like the French Rafale jets, specifically to strengthen their capabilities in high-altitude border regions like Ladakh. India also possesses one of the most feared missile systems in the world, the supersonic BrahMos missile, which was jointly developed with Russia. This missile can strike targets deep inside enemy lines at speeds 3 times faster than the speed of sound, and it is almost impossible to intercept. Deploying BrahMos missiles along Ladakh or the broader Himalayan border would give India a massive strategic advantage. It would allow Indian forces to threaten Chinese infrastructure, airfields, and military bases deep into Tibet within just minutes, essentially holding China's critical western regions hostage. But even with all these reasons for China to jump into a conflict on Pakistan's side, there are some very solid reasons why Beijing might just stay quiet and not try to intervene at all. First off, China's economy, after decades of breakneck growth, is now barely crawling forward. 2023 and 2024 were brutal. Economic growth took a massive hit from a huge real estate crash and extremely weak domestic consumer demand. China is also piling up record levels of debt. According to one IMF report, China's government debt rose to 60.5% of GDP in 2024. That's up from 38.5% just 5 years earlier. And its overall debt, including corporations, households, and local governments, is now around 312% of GDP, among the highest levels anywhere on Earth. Even local governments are drowning in unpaid mortgages for ghost housing complexes and empty shopping malls. China's leaders have gotten so desperate they're injecting billions of dollars into the system, desperately trying to hit their modest 5% growth targets. On top of that, China's population has actually started shrinking. In 2023, the country recorded its lowest birth rate ever, losing roughly 1.4 million people. Over the next few years, nearly 300 million Chinese workers are set to retire from the workforce entirely. That means fewer people spending, huge pension liabilities, and rising youth unemployment. Now, imagine adding a massive military conflict into this already strained economic environment. China simply can't afford another expensive, destabilizing adventure right now. They desperately need every bit of their resources and focus to reboot their economy and support their rapidly aging society. Second, China's military is already stretched thin in other critical regions. For instance, Beijing has steadily expanded its naval and air presence in the South China Sea, frequently clashing with neighbors like Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia over disputed islands and reefs. And then there's the issue of the Taiwan Strait. Beijing constantly warns it might someday reunify Taiwan by force if necessary. The US, meanwhile, keeps sending aircraft carriers through the region and boosting military alliances with Taiwan's partners. China understands very well just how dangerously explosive that situation could become. With all of this happening, opening a third front against India in the Himalayas would be nothing short of disastrous. If war broke out, China's military resources and focus would be dangerously divided, forcing Beijing to pull precious troops, missiles, fighter jets, and naval assets away from critical areas like Taiwan and the South China Sea. Even worse, a Himalayan war could escalate and potentially draw in larger global powers. Imagine if the US Navy chose to support India, or if Russia felt pressure to back China militarily. China definitely doesn't want to risk such a scenario. And it's not just China that would be deeply worried. A regional war involving China would quickly shake global politics to the core. For example, the United States has steadily moved closer to India through alliances like the Quad and various bilateral defense agreements. Publicly, the US would obviously call for peace and restraint. That's our standard response whenever India and Pakistan clash. In fact, both China and the US have already urged immediate de-escalation after the recent attack in Kashmir. But realistically, if Chinese troops or fighter jets actually moved into Pakistan to threaten India, then Washington would quietly but urgently ramp up support for India, sharing crucial intelligence, accelerating arms deliveries, or maybe even providing direct diplomatic backing. Russia would also face a tough situation. Moscow maintains a strategic partnership with Beijing, yet at the same time, Russia is historically one of India's largest arms suppliers, selling advanced weapon systems to New Delhi. Russia would probably attempt neutrality at first, calling for peace publicly, while quietly offering diplomatic support to both sides to maintain leverage. Middle Eastern powers could get dragged into the mix as well. Pakistan has historically relied on Gulf allies, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for financial aid, political backing, and occasional military assistance. But in a crisis involving China and India, these countries would tread extremely carefully. In reality, nobody would genuinely win a war involving China, least of all Beijing itself. Sure, China generally benefits from an India that's somewhat unstable or distracted, but there's a big difference between benefiting from a bit of instability and getting dragged into a full-blown catastrophic war. War with India isn't something Beijing actually wants. It's way too costly, risky, and destabilizing, especially considering all the internal issues China is already facing. Beijing knows perfectly well that the main trigger for all this tension, terrorist groups operating freely inside Pakistan, isn't something they can afford to ignore anymore. If this time, India doesn't decisively deal with these terrorists inside Pakistan's territory, China might feel it has no choice but to step in and take care of them itself. Because at this point, China simply can't afford another day of uncertainty, tension, or threats to its huge investments and thousands of citizens in the region. One way or another, they'll want this terrorism issue dealt with once and for all, preferably without triggering a bigger conflict. Now, let's delve into the global political impact of China's strategies. It's important to understand how China's expanding influence reshapes international dynamics. Countries around the world are responding in various ways, some with cooperation and others with caution. The balance of power is shifting, and this has profound implications for global stability. Moving on to Russia's dilemma, we see a complex situation unfolding. Russia finds itself at a crossroads, balancing its own interests with the rising influence of China. The relationship between these two nations is multifaceted, involving both collaboration and competition. How Russia navigates this delicate balance will be crucial for its future on the world stage. The Middle East remains a region of significant geopolitical interest. Nations such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey are key players with their own strategic ambitions. The balance of power in this region can dramatically influence global stability. Understanding their motivations and alliances is crucial for any comprehensive geopolitical analysis. War comes with a heavy price, both economically and humanely. The financial burden can cripple economies, while the human cost leaves scars that last generations. It's essential to consider these factors when analyzing any conflict. The true cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield. Pakistan has been a front-line state in the fight against terrorism. The challenges it faces are complex, involving both internal and external factors. Addressing the root causes of terrorism requires a multifaceted approach, including economic development, education, and regional cooperation. The international community's role in supporting Pakistan's efforts cannot be understated. In conclusion, understanding the intricate dynamics of global geopolitics is essential for navigating today's world. From the strategic ambitions of Middle Eastern powers to the profound costs of war and the ongoing battle against terrorism, each factor plays a critical role. Staying informed and engaged is key to making sense of these complex issues.